Sayın hocalarım, değerli katılımcılar, programa sempozyumun 3. oturumu ile devam ediyoruz. Bu oturumun başkanlığını Profesör Doktor Terrence Kleven yapacaktır. Oturumun konuşmacıları Waseem El Rayes, Muhammed Faruque, Mokdad Arfa, Mohammad Azadpur. Buyurunuz hocam.
Welcome to our session this afternoon. Again, my name is Terry Kleven from Central College. And we have 4 speakers, so we'll stick very closely to a schedule so that we make sure that we have a time for question and answer at the end. So we'll not have questions on the way through, but save them up and we'll get a chance to speak together at the end. Our first presenter is Dr. Waseem El Rayes, who is a researcher and teacher at James Madison College at Michigan State University. He specializes in political philosophy, especially focusing on ancient Greek and Arabic political philosophy, and especially the reception of Plato and Aristotle in the works of Al-Farabi, Al-Ghazali, Ibn Rushd, and Ibn Khaldun. And so we welcome Dr. El Rayes here today. A number of us are a little bit jet-lagged, but we hope we won't fall asleep. And so welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for the organizers. This paper is concerned with how contemporary Ibn Khaldun scholars understand the philosophical value of this work. In contextualizing its subject matter, this paper is compelled to reflect back on an old opinion that has long cast its shadow on the study of philosophy in Islamdom, an antiquated opinion that this conference correctly, for its general purposes, wishes to look beyond, but that continues to cloud the field in general and the study of Ibn Khaldun in particular. This is from the call of papers for this conference, and my paper is partly inspired by that call. I'm speaking here of that quote, opinion made popular by Ernest Renan that Islamic philosophy had stopped after Ibn Rushd, unquote. Along with the conference organizers, I acknowledge a great deal of contemporary scholarly works on philosophy and Kelam in the Islamic world that combated with measurable success this opinion. But unlike the organizers, I do not share the sentiment that this opinion, quote, was successfully combated, unquote. As I show with respect to contemporary studies of Ibn Khaldun's Mukaddime'sinde, this opinion remains potent in undermining critical engagement with medieval Islamic texts. The reasons why this opinion remains a force in scholarly circles have less to do with the strength of its historical evidence and more to do with moral and cultural prejudice. This paper is divided into 3 sections. For the interest of time, I will only address the first 2. The first section revisits that infamous opinion in order to re-expose the hidden prejudices behind its enduring legacy. Since Renan's 1883 lecture, Islam and Science, is the classical statement on this opinion, this section provides a review of the arguments and their scholarly impact. The second section moves from Renan's blanket judgment regarding the history of philosophy in Islamdom to explore modern iterations of this opinion with respect to the specific case of the Muqaddimah, a case best exemplified by Gibb and echoed most recently by Robert Orwin. This section illustrates how Renan's fundamental assumptions remain at play from the early 20th century, the case of Gibb, to the early 21st century, the case of Robert Orwin. Renan's March 29, 1883 lecture, Islam and Science, created at the time a great sensation in intellectual circles, not only in Paris, but also in major Arab cities. Written more than 140 years ago, it remains of note in many Arab circles, academic and otherwise. And this despite the fact that a full public translation of this lecture was not available in Arabic until the early 21st century, in 2005 to be exact. This lecture is largely noted for its claim that philosophy in Islam died with the death of Ibn Rushd in the 12th century. But this claim itself does not explain the lecture's enduring note. What contributed to its fame and persistence over the years, at least in the Arabic-speaking world, is a contemporaneous response by the celebrated Muslim reformist Jamaluddin al-Afghani, a response published in French on the 18th of May, 1883, a little over a month after the original lecture. This response, like Renan's lecture, had no full public translation in Arabic until recently. It was not by accident, however, that both the lecture of a famous Orientalist and the response of a famous Muslim reformist were not given wider circulation in Arabic. Excising the full version of both texts from public record had little to do with Renan's proclamation of the death of philosophy in Islamdom, and even less with Afghani's counter regarding philosophy's more than likely modern resurrection in that part of the world. Rather, it had almost everything to do with the principles behind that claim by Renan and with Afghani's failure to challenge these principles. Renan's central claim was conceived out of a structure of openly prejudicial and unapologetically hostile assumptions regarding the nature of Islam as a religion and of Arabs as a race, quote unquote. Afghani's response, while making the case for the revival of philosophy in Islam, conceded much to Renan's prejudice against Islam and Muslims. This prejudice is an essential feature of the arguments that set philosophy in fundamental opposition with Muslim beliefs and practices. Renan's quote-unquote authoritative analysis of the relationship between Islam and science can be summed up as follows. First, he rejects the notion that there is such a thing as Arab or Muslim science. Second, the intellectual decline of Muslims that began, in Renan's view, by the middle of the 12th century is fundamental to their being Muslims, and as such is not a transitory phenomenon. Third, of all world religions, Islam is fundamentally antagonistic to secularism, which is the vital condition for social progress. Renan's grants, almost begrudgingly, a 500 years flourishing of philosophy at the beginning of the history of Islam and during Arab rule. But no sooner he grants this history than he quickly proclaims that such flourishing happened in spite of Islam, of the Arab race, and of the Arabic language. Instead, that flourishing was, quote, wholly the work of Parsis, of Christians, of Jews, of Hararians, Ismailis, and of Muslims who were intimately in revolt against their own religion, unquote. Neither believing Muslims nor native Arabs were ever involved with this flourishing. What is more, the flourishing of philosophy during the period was of stunted variety, carried on as it was in Arabic, a language inferior to Greek, and, quote, a very impractical instrument for metaphysics, unquote. Renan's evidence in support of this sweeping claims regarding Islam, Muslims, and Arabs is, at best, incoherent. Race, for him, is the essential frame for analyzing world historical development. Beyond its now obvious moral bankruptcy, racialist history is and always have been intellectually incoherent. It logically negates the very phenomenon it claims to empirically observe, assess, and analyze, namely historical development and progress. For Renan, the so-called Arab race, like most races, is a category of analysis that is outside of history. It is fixed and unchanging. His lecture detects no difference between the Arabs of pre-Islamic period and those who came after it. Arabs in particular are outside of history. I'll skip this part. Renan does not, at the introduction of his lecture, inform his esteemed Sorbonne audience of why, of any practical importance behind his theorizing of Islam and science. However, near the end of the lecture, he does reveal a practical purpose to his theory, namely to combat a naively positive view about Islam and Muslims by European liberals. The liberals who defend Islam are not acquainted with it. Islam is the indiscernible union of the spiritual and temporal. It is the reign of dogma. It is the heaviest chain humanity has ever carried. Renan was motivated by a zeal to protect the word, his word, from Islam, a religion that, according to him, oppresses the vast portions of our globe, imposing on them the most antithetical idea to progress, a state founded on a supposed revelation, theology governing the society, unquote. Behind the facade of objective scholarship in Renan's deep fear, phobia of Islam and Muslims, it is clear by now that for Renan there has never effectively been intellectual decline of Arab and Muslims, because Arabs and Muslims were never intellectually ascendant in the first place. His prejudice against Islam and Muslims in general and deep racism against Arabs in particular are plain to all those who read the full text of the lecture. There, Renan makes no attempt to hide his animus against a people whose language, history, and text he supposedly spent a lifetime studying. It seems remarkable, therefore, that for far too long, Arab intellectuals commenting on Renan's suppositions did not see fit to highlight his racism. For the purposes of this paper, I only address this issue from the point of view of early Muslim reformers. Late 19th and early 20th century Muslim reformers were almost by definition intellectuals who believed in two related ideas about modern Islam. One, that it needs reform, and two, that it is reformable. First, they recognized in modern Islam, and by extension Muslim societies, crucial problems requiring religious reforms. And second, they recognized in Islam, and by extension Muslim societies, the real potential for reform. With these ideas held firmly in belief, Muslim reformers were able to tolerate hostile, cast as radical, Orientalist critique of Islam without absorbing the racist frames that often accompany these critiques. Accordingly, Muslim reformers appear to have felt little tension when separating, as they believed they could, Orientalist theorizing from Orientalist prejudice. But what value did these reformers find in Orientalist ideas that justified for them the need to look beyond these racist Orientalist frames? For early Muslim reformers like Afghani and Abdo, European thought in general and the work of Orientalists in particular were indispensable for their project of reform. As steeped in prejudice as the works of Orientalists may be, they provided for these reformers both a critical, outside perspective on problems of social and political decline in Muslim societies, as well as an essential outline to address these problems. Orientalist thought posed the problems of societal development and decline as essentially cultural, meaning moral and intellectual. This cultural casting appealed to 19th century Muslim reformers more interested in cultural as opposed to material explanations of social progress or decline. Orientalist discourse focuses attention on clearly definable intellectual problems. Even more, Orientalist thought, as essentially a European thought, concerned with the study of the Orient, seemed to be in a position to serve as intermediary between Islam and Europe. Accordingly, Orientalist thought, along with general European thought, provided a path to a tested and ready model of socio-political reforms adaptable to the needs and conditions of Muslim societies. And yet, it is precisely here that early Muslim reformers have failed to see the full extent of Orientalist prejudice that goes beyond personal bias or bigotry and bleed into the very foundations of their theorizing. As Said and others have shown, Orientalist discourse is a study in fundamental contrast between the West and the rest. As argued above, Muslim reformers were well aware of extreme conceptions by Orientalists of cultural difference, but they did not see these conceptions as essential to Orientalist scholarship itself, to the value of what would later be called by Said the Orientalist discourse. much more cognizant of common humanity than their Orientalist counterparts, Muslim reformers understood cultural difference as real and important, but that it does not entail irreconcilable moral states. And yet, these reformers fail to understand that Orientalist prejudice is much deeper than individual scholars' totalizing views about Islam, Muslims, and Arabs. These totalizing views are baked deep into the logic of the theorizing itself, making it impossible to bridge the so-called East-West divide, a bridging that is key to knowledge adaptation so essential to the project of Muslim reformers. Orientalist theorizing of Islam is built on an unshakable foundation of European cultural supremacy. On this foundation, a European studies Islam as an exotic or alien culture whose only value is in reinforcing by means of contrast European supremacy. Hence Raynan's need to school European liberals in the inferiority of Islam. On this foundation, there is no real value to the study of the cultural production of medieval Islam. Muslim philosophy make no real contribution to history or philosophy, or to echo Raynan's argument, it did not teach Europeans anything that they would not have discovered on their own. Afghani could, as indeed he does in his response to Raynan, dispute the details of Orientalist scholars' account of Muslim history. But this response by Afghani missed the real point of Islam and science, as indeed Raynan's only reply to Afghani's response shows. It is not the factual history that concerns the famous Orientalist, but rather it is the legitimation of present and future European cultural, indeed racial, supremacy. Afghani and reformers like him could not help but internalize, in whole or in part, this supremacy, and when they sought European diagnosis of the model solution for the problem of social decline. How much do I have? 2 minutes. Wow, okay. Okay, I supposedly had 20, but anyway. Okay, so the second section. Perhaps no others, well, I'll wind down. The paper is there. The next section, I link it with Gibb and Orwin and how they interpret Ibn Khaldun. You will see Raynan's principles, echoes in both Gibb and Orwin, even though their approach, or their Orientalist approach appears on its surface as being simply more congenial to Islam. Gibb appears as a friend of Islam and Muslim, but fundamentally they both, Gibb in the early 20th century and Orwin in the early 21st century, rejects the notion of Ibn Khaldun being a philosopher for specifically the same foundation, is that they want to gatekeep philosophy, and that it is a project which is essentially a European project, and that Muslims have inability. You cannot be both a Muslim and a philosopher. But I'll end up here. Thank you.
Thank you. Our second speaker is Dr. Faruque, who is the Inayat Malik Associate Professor, a Taft Center Fellow at the University of Cincinnati, and a former visiting scholar at Harvard University. He has an award-winning book, Sculpting the Self, which is a study of selfhood and subjectivity in Islam and in non-Islamic philosophic literature. We welcome Dr. Faruque.
Thank you.
Is it turned on? There you are.
Thank you, Dr. Terrence, for that kind introduction. Bismillah. So I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers for this wonderful conference and giving us an opportunity to share some humble thoughts on the following topic. So my topic is entitled, What It Means to Be Human in a Post-Enlightenment World, a View from Islamic Philosophy. I hope everybody can hear me. People in the back, can you guys hear me well? All right. Wonderful. So let me begin with, it's 2:53. So I have Let me begin with a question. What does it mean to be human in the wake of the Enlightenment? So one can think about multiple approaches when one asks that kind of question, because it's a historical period in the West. So you think about Kantian approach focused on autonomy, self-determination, and freedom. So it's a version of individualism. Or you can also think about Nietzschean approach or Foucauldian approach influenced by Nietzsche and others. The Nietzschean approach is based on self-creation, Übermensch, the superhuman, aesthetics of the self. So it's a form of individualism coupled with subjectivism at the end of the day. And combined with Kantianism and Nietzscheanism and Foucauldianism, what you have are other approaches such as social constructionism and postmodernism. And I'm sure some of these terms, at least postmodernism, is familiar to us. So in this conception, selfhood, when we're talking about the self, what it means to be human, it has no inherent reality, as it is ultimately constructed through economic infrastructure, fields of discourse, social dimension, race, class, gender, neurobiology, evolutionary psychology, etc. And there can be many other approaches, and some of these conversations are based on my humble book, The Sculpting the Self, and a half dozen or so articles. So I'm kind of rapidly summarizing. But anyway, so these are some of the approaches from the perspective of Western thought, you might say. But there can also be Islamic approaches to this very important question. So here I'm going to be focusing on Mullah Sadra, a 17th century Persian Iranian philosopher, and his conception of what I call the anthropocosmic self. So this idea of the anthropocosmic self, it's a philosophical interpretation. It's not directly found in the text, but it's based on a lot of the material in the text. So this conception of the self, in contrast to the Kantian or Nietzschean conceptions, is focused on relationality and interconnectedness with the rest of the universe, the rest of reality, and with a deep focus on the spiritual and philosophical development. So that's going to be, in a nutshell, my argument. I'm going to focus on Mullah Sadra, and I'm going to kind of sort of positioning them vis-a-vis the other Western approaches. So let's begin with Mullah Sadra and his conception of what it means to be human. So when it comes to Mullah Sadra, his response to what it means to be human begins with self-knowledge, ma'rifatun nafs. Since for him, the project of philosophy itself is motivated by the question of finding the true nature of the self. I mean, this is a very fundamental question. It's like everyone from the street to the highest philosopher has some kind of self-image about themselves, like as a self, as an individual. But it also has deeper philosophical implications. And we're trying to address what it means to be human in the wake of some of the most important events that took place in the West, but that now have repercussions around the world, and you can see how these things affect everyone. Because when I'm talking about individualism, I would not be mistaken to say that, even people in Istanbul, you can see trends which actually suggest that that's the kind of normal sense of the, everyday sense of the self that people have come to sort of internalize. All right, so because in Sadra's conception, it begins with the true nature of the self, but it still should not be misunderstood as going inward in the Cartesian sense, the famous French philosopher Descartes, so that what we end up finding as we turn our gaze on ourselves is some kind of a ghost in the machine, as Gilbert Ryle has famously observed. In fact, for Sadra, our self is never absent from itself, since the core of the self is constituted by consciousness, which is continuous, presential, and never interrupting. Consequently, any sort of introspective Cartesian dive into the self only results in a representation or an objectified image of the self, which is not the self itself, since it is always a subject in relation to a knowing object. This also explains why Sadra launches a relentless attack on various theories of knowledge in Islamic philosophy that operate on the basis of a subject-object dichotomy. So in his third volume, in his magnum opus, Al-Hikmah al-Muta'aliya fil Asfar al-Aqliya al-Arba'a, Sadra addresses theories that variously, especially in the third volume of this book called Asfar, he addresses theories that variously attempt to explain knowledge and perception through different theories, such as tajrid, abstraction, irtisam, representation, idafa, relation, or arad, accident, subsisting in the mind. So he kind of refutes all of these different theories. But Sadra does grant that these theories do possess some explanatory power, but they're utterly helpless. They're utterly helpless when it comes to the all-important question of self-knowledge or ma'rifat al-nafs. For Sadra, self-knowledge, or the fact that I know that I am me, that is the subject that has the minimum knowledge of itself as itself, is prior to even self-perception. For this reason, he forcefully asserts that one cannot have knowledge of oneself as a bare eye by means of one's mental actions, such as thinking. That is to say, if knowledge of my action functions as a cause of my knowledge of myself, it will lead to a circular reasoning, because knowledge of myself is already implied in and serves as the cause of the knowledge of my very action. I know it's very dense stuff. Details in the book I have to summarize here, and I'm kind of smiling to myself because it's already 7 minutes. This happens the moment I try to infer existence or knowledge of myself through a perceptual act, such as thinking, because I will notice that it will not be possible for me to know my act of thinking except after having knowledge of myself. And if I did not know myself except after knowing myself, it will result in a vicious circle, though. Therefore, no matter how I try to infer my knowledge of myself through thinking or even doubting, like Descartes, it is bound to fail, since such performative actions already presuppose an underlying subject that makes thinking possible first. The only way to avoid this vicious circle would be to argue that I'm already acquainted with myself in some a priori fashion, which is existentially identical with the very being of the reality of myself. In other words, I know myself directly through my consciousness, which is the very nature of the self, because the essence of myself at its most basic level is this very consciousness. In light of this argument, it is easy to see that the most basic form of self-knowledge transcends the subject-object dichotomy, including objectivized knowledge of the self in the mind, which involves the polarity of the subject that knows and the object that is known. Wow. So, I mean, in philosophy, as you know, it builds up from one premise to the next, but here in the interest of time, I'll have to skip over a lot of things. So, build on the idea of self-knowledge. As I said, the next thing to notice in this scheme is the idea of how he claims, Mullah Sadr claims that in order to have true knowledge of oneself, one must overcome the spiritual and moral obstacles that prevent one from seeing one's true nature. I mean, these sentences are laden with lots of philosophical implications, because we are familiar with the Western philosophy in the last 500 years. One of the things you can confidently say, and here I agree with Foucault, that with Descartes, you simply think, oh, you can simply meditate in the corner of your room, smoking, I don't know, whatever you want, on a wintry day, and you simply have all sorts of thoughts, like you're in a dream, there's an evil genie, kind of, making you believe all sorts of things. But in the end, you're doubting, and through doubting, you say, oh, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. So all you need to figure out the true knowledge of yourself, you just need a kind of rational mind. You don't need to think about any moral or any kind of spiritual factors, because the self, any rational adult mind, is assumed to be transparent to itself. It's a huge assumption. And it's no accident that contemporary philosophers critique Descartes from left to right. Moving on. For Mullah Sadr, it's not that simple. But nonetheless, the self is the Archimedean point from which one is able to make sense of the nature of reality. Because he argues that all that we see or experience in the world we can only see it through ourself, dhatina, and that there is nothing out there that is not already within the self, which means nothing is completely mind independent. Moreover, the self as an aspirational reality, so this might lead to some kind of, I don't know, confusion that it's kind of Fichtean or Hegelian idealism. It's not at all like that, because this self is, the Archimedean point, it's not a given, it's something to be attained. So hence, aspirational. The self as an aspirational reality reaches ultimate perfection at its apex, at which point, quote, everything that exists become a part of the self, dhatina, and its powers permeate the entirety of existence. So for Mullah Sadra, the world in a certain sense, is the knowing subject. It is thus not so difficult to see that for Sadra, self-knowledge is inseparable from any conception of the self, as mentioned earlier. And he goes on to then say how, in order to overcome the moral and spiritual obstacles, you have to combine theoretical intellect, al-aql al-nazari, and then practical intellect. And here he is following the peripatetics to some extent, but then upon closer inspection, it appears that he is also drawing a lot from the post-Ibn Arabian tradition, Ibn Arabi, Qaisari, Qunawi, and all of these people. So if you look at his scheme of theoretical intellect, it's more or less like the Masha philosophers, like material intellect, al-aql al-hayulani, habitual intellect, actual intellect, acquired intellect. But then when it comes to practical intellect, he has these dimensions: purifications of the outer self, tahdhib al-zahir, purification of the inner self, tahdhib al-batin, adorning of the self, tahall al-nafs, annihilation of the self from its fana al-nafs an dhatina. So some of those later things you will not find in any peripatetic philosophy, including Avicenna's Isharat. Here, incidentally, he also, following the school of Ibn Arabi, combines a very vexing question in epistemology, namely the experience, the mystical experience. So he combines Kashf Suri and Kashf Ma'nawi, and kind of, for his epistemology, has 4 degrees. Like, first you have intuition, thought, and then intellect, and then the heart, and then finally the intellect or spirit, where you have a kind of direct witnessing of the spiritual realities. But anyway, so given all of this, let's now focus on the conclusion and the kind of implications of this, and relate it to the main question that I asked. So 5 minutes?
Yes.
Yeah. The Quran states that human nature is made according to fitra, determined by God, which is further corroborated by a hadith that says that God created human beings in his image. خَلَقَ اللَّهُ آدَمَ عَلَى صُورَتِهِ. I know there are some people who think surah refers to Adam, but also in Bukhari too, there's another one that has the word Ar-Rahman, clearly referring to God. Anyway, the ethical and ontological implications of such a view of human nature cannot be more significant, as Islamic metaphysics describes God as the absolutely unconditioned being, al-wujud al-labishan al-maqsami, beyond any thought, imagination, and conceptual categories. Being created in God's image, human nature too, in the final analysis, defies having any fixed essence, since God cannot be defined through a specific image or form. Put another way, human nature in its primordial purity and original constitution is in a state of non-determination, as it is made in the form of the formless. Formless because the absolute and infinite nature of God ultimately transcends any form. Thus, in Mullah Sadra's holistic perspective, being a self requires overcoming individualism and seeing the interconnectedness between God, the individual, and community. This is the idea of the anthropocosmic self. It is to realize that cosmos and self are not 2 separate realities, but 2 sides of the same coin, a coin that reflects divine unity. That there is an organismic unity which pervades all forms of existence. And moreover, everything is connected to everything else, as Al-Qunawi said, kullu shay'in fihi kullu shay. So ultimately, the reality of the self, in this perspective, the anthropocosmic self, unlike individualism, is no longer located in the conventional everyday eye. So you can see this is very much opposed to versions of individualism, whether it's Kantian, Nietzschean or Hobbesian, especially the Hobbesian, because according to one, Hobbes' conception and one of the important figures when it comes to individualism, so he has all of these attributes. At the heart of it is the idea of selfishness being the kind of center of human identity. If you're into economics, you can see how economists make use of that idea. But anyway, for Hobbes, an individual is defined by the following attributes. He is or she is or they are competitive, acquisitive, possessive, restless, individualistic, self-concerned, and insatiable in our demands for whatever we see in isolation as our own good. So if you reflect what is happening today in our world, like climate change, destruction of nature, this has been going on for centuries, going back to Bacon and then of course Galileo and others. Of course capitalism included later on. But anyway, seeing yourself at the center of the universe, thinking about your own good, separating yourself from the rest of reality, it's not simply an act of armchair thinking. It has real-life consequences. Everybody is paying for this. So the anthropocosmic self makes an intervention here. Just 1 minute. Makes a very important intervention here. Because the anthropocosmic self requires understanding that the self has no fixed definition. Because the state of fitra is a state of non-determination as it is made in the image of the formless. It is for this reason that being a self is a journey, not a destination. Ibn Arabi explains it beautifully through the notion of maqam la maqam, a station of no station, which means the goal of the human journey should be to contemplate and reflect the divine, whose essence is non-delimited. But at a more approachable level, one should try to overcome negative attributes such as egoism, nepotism, ethnocentrism, chauvinistic nationalism, which you can see all around today, which are antithetical to the divine spirit. In its stead, one should try to expand the field of what I call one's awareness and cultivate a sense of what I call cosmic consciousness. Cosmic consciousness integrating family, community, nation, world, spirit in one's sensitivity. Thank you.
Thank you. Our third speaker is Professor Arfa Mencia, who is a retired emeritus professor of higher education and a distinguished member of the Tunisian Academy of Sciences, Letters, and Arts. He's in the Department of Islamic Studies. He holds his habilitation in philosophy from the University of Tunis and his master's degree in philosophy from the University of Tunis as well. Thank you. 17, yeah.
17, okay. In his Mukaddime'sinde,
Oh, here. Yeah, it's good.
it's
Go ahead.
12, yes, okay. In his Muqaddimah, Ibn Khaldun has accomplished a remarkable encyclopedic work. He undertook to expose the sciences then known in Arab Islamic civilization down to the evolved phases in which he knew them. For each particular science, he defined the science in question, its subject matter, the internal issues that shaped it, and set out its historical development, indicating the decisive and major turning points that marked it. A science is taken individually, what comes under its essence or nature, and what is external. Ibn Khaldun discourse is therefore concerned on the one hand with the philosophy of science, and the other hand with the and on the other hand with the inscription of science in time, that's to say, its history, grasping its essence and scrutinizing its history. We will limit ourselves in the present paper to Ibn Khaldun's discourse on Ilm-iKelâm. Epistemology, general epistemology. For Ibn Khaldun, the classification of sciences is based on classification of being and intelligibles grasped by reason. The epistemological structure in the order of knowledge conforms and reproduces the metaphysical and intelligible structure in the order of being and intelligibility. The structure of a science is determined by the realities, haqa'iq, distinct from each other. For each particular science, Ibn Khaldun gives its principles, definition, object, essential issues, and demonstrative device. These are the constitutive element of a science, the classical components required in each science. It's the form of the science, principles of a science. These are the principles on which a particular science is based. Normally, this is the role of first philosophy. The subject matter and angle of examination in a science. The subject matter, the starting point, is this set of realities intelligenced or grasped, mafhum, by human reason. Each of these realities has its essential accidents. The angle of examination, sometimes the object alone does not suffice to determine a science in its specificity, as when this object is common to two sciences. The subject matter is no longer determined solely by the kind of being studied in a particular science, but also by the angle from which it is examined, min jihati, min haythu. Determination of questions, scientific question and essential accident. Questions are determined and ordered by aligning themselves according to the articulation of the essential accidents of the intelligible reality. The object of the science in question, انقسام الموضوع, considered from the particular angle of the type of examination, جهة النظر. An essential question in one science may be accidental in another. The questions that may be dealt with accidentally in another science are to be treated in an essential manner in their own science. Since the questions deal with the essential attributes of the object, they must be studied in a systematic and exhaustive manner, mustawfa. Apodicticity or demonstrative nature of question. Questions are demonstrated al-masail mubarhana with sufficient evidence معطى حقه من البراهين بوجوه برهانية. Composed character of demonstration. The argumentative device in the question is made up of premises, syllogism, and theories. Now we have to the application of the form of science, this form of science, to Ilm-iKelâm. As a science, Ilm-iKelâm is based on principles and has its own subject matter. It is structured around essential questions which are dealt with through a set of demonstration and developments. Principles of Ilm-iKelâm. Let's take up Ibn Khaldun's famous bipartite classification of sciences into sapiential or philosophical sciences, العلوم الحكمية الفلسفية, and traditional sciences, العلوم النقلية الوضعية. So, Ilm-iKelâm sets on principles that are provided previously by religious law, transmitted by tradition, sama', and interpreted by the ancestors, as-salaf. Definition and subject matter of Ilm-iKelâm. His definition is linked to how, Ibn Khaldun's definition is linked to how he discussed the birth and the development of Ilm-iKelâm. He establishes a relationship between the articles of faith developed by Ilm-iKelâm, its emergency within the community, and its historical evolution. It is a history of Ilm-iKelâm that is intended to verify its definition. And the definition of Ilm-iKelâm is used in turn as a standard for its history, the conformity to the essence. There are two main elements in this definition: the article of faith and the rational arguments to establish and defend them. Strictly speaking, the content of this science is limited to the argumentative device. Dogmas are not part of the science since they are determined by religious law. The angle of examination of the object. You remember this famous comparison made by Ibn Khaldun between the physical body as an object common to the physical science of the philosophers and physical theories developed by the mutakallimun, when the latter use certain physical bodies to demonstrate the existence of God. Essential question of Ilm-iKelâm. The articulation of Ilm-iKelâm in the essential question follows exactly the articles of faith, aqad, imaniya, imposed by the religious law. It's true that historically the number of questions in Ilm-iKelâm has not always been constant. Other questions maybe have been added. Just as the object of Ilm-iKelâm must be distinct from that of the other sciences, its essential question must also be quite distinct from those of the others. Logical nature of Ilm-iKelâm. We said that Ibn Khaldun's conception of Ilm-iKelâm emphasizes the demonstrative procedure. As it was conceived, Ilm-iKelâm was in its very essence made up of logical processes. The question is, what logic? But I go to the history of Ilm-iKelâm, the second part, Genesis. Ibn Khaldun shows at the outset that were the dogmas defined by religious law, including the attributes of God. In their understanding, this provoked controversy by recourse to the proofs of reason in addition to those of tradition. Constitution or generation of the science of Ilm-iKelâm. About the production of the science, Ibn Khaldun describes the mechanism by which it occurs, comes into existence. To this purpose, he uses terms such as istihdath, huduth, that is to say to the advent. That has the same sense as that of the philosophical technical term kawn, generation. The ancient way, ancient way. Theoretical premises and rules. The manner of the ancient or former mutakallimun is characterized by an argumentative device that is based on premises and is judged to be in solidarity with the dogmas, and therefore obeys the rule of their reciprocity with regard to their truth and falsity, a rule that we will explain later. Let's come to Al-Baqillani's work. The ancient way was put forward by Al-Baqillani, who, through his work, completed the doctrine of the school. He undertook two major actions: refining the method by endowing it with the theoretical premises on which argumentation rests. Establishing this capital rule: the nullity of logical argument renders null and void the truth it intends to prove. Moreover, he integrates rational premises with dogmas in terms of the obligation to believe in them, just as articles of faith. The obligation to believe is thus extended to cover an indissociable whole, dogmas and premises. Al-Juwayni. Ibn Khaldun includes Al-Juwayni with his Summa, Kitab al-Shamil, and its summary, Kitab al-Irshad, in this former method, and makes a nuanced assessment of his method. In addition to its logical formulation, one may wonder about the nature of the link. Presumably, it belongs to the legal theory, i.e., it's taken from the register of the science of the foundation of jurisprudence, Ilm Usul al-Fiqh, to which the same Al-Baqillani devoted a treatise. That means, in this science, the famous rule was in force: if a legal obligation can only be fulfilled by a determined means, this itself becomes obligatory. The way of the Delta Mutakallimun, the moderns, Al-Ghazali and the leader, followed by Al-Razi. Ibn Khaldun puts the modern method immediately after Al-Juwayni. New status for logic of the philosopher, critical examination of the premises and reasoning of the ancient Kalam, dissociation of argument and dogmas, and abandonment of the reciprocity rule. New arguments in favor of the dogmas. That's the work of Al-Ghazali. These arguments became invalid, but the dogmas still continued to be true, and could even more be supported by new premises and arguments taken from the philosopher, physics, metaphysics, and so on. The technical logic reason. The method of the Mutakallimun was not a separate logic. It was a method, and methods belongs in Ibn Khaldun's conception to the history of science, not to the science itself. For Al-Ghazali, this reasoning amounted in the terms of the newly adopted logic to a negative conjunctive conditional proposition. It is the negation of the implication. Let's go to our concluding remarks. Our concluding remarks will focus on the specificity of Ibn Khaldun's discourse, on his way of conceiving Ilm-iKelâm and its history, and on the opportunity for our contemporaries to draw inspiration from it. First, specificity of Ibn Khaldun's discourse. Ibn Khaldun's thought lies at the confluences of at least three disciplines that he knew and described well in their development up to their evolved phases: the Felsefe, the Kelam, and the Tasawwuf. Ibn Khaldun's discourse presupposes multiple skills, two of which we can appreciate. Consequently, our remarks have focused first on the treatment of an epistemological nature, and then, in a second moment, on a treatment of an historical nature. A recent history. From an historical point of view, epistemology is complemented by the contribution of someone who knows how to scrutinize and analyze intellectual history. He gives an account of every scientific event, whether doctrinal turning point, adoption of a theory, or abandonment of another. When, in the history of Ilm-iKelâm, he presents to us the rivalry between two unequal but theoretically developed methods, he brought to light the nodal point or reason, illah, on which the attitude of scholars towards logic depended, when they accepted it or when they rejected it. When explaining scholars' scientific choice, he used to say, meditate on this and try to know what the scholars grasp and from where they take their ideas in the doctrines they choose. مآخذهم, by مآخذهم. Meditate on this and try to know what the scholars grasp and from where they take their ideas in the doctrines they choose. The inspiration for our contemporaries. It seems difficult now to take Ibn Khaldun's work into account for our contemporaries who deal with Ilm-iKelâm, whether they are historians or theologians. Of course, while taking the necessary critical epistemological and historical distance. There are lessons to be learned for history of Ilm-iKelâm, and it is possible to draw inspiration from it and propose the following periodization. The Genesis, then the Kelam in the manner of the ancient, up to Al-Juwayni, the Kelam in the manner of the moderns, the early moderns, and the late moderns until after Ibn Khaldun, the revival. Now, the new Kelam, Ilm-iKelâm al-Jadid, for what has come to be known as the new Kelam, Al-Kelam al-Jadid, it seems difficult to make progress in the future without first grasping, understanding, and evaluating the epistemological approach and historical description provided by Ibn Khaldun. And thank you.
Thank you. And our final speaker for this panel is Dr. Azadpur. He is a professor of philosophy at San Francisco State University and earned his PhD from the University of Virginia and conducted postdoctoral research at Johns Hopkins University. We welcome Dr. Azadpur as our final speaker in this panel.
Thank you, Dr. Kleven. So I have how many minutes?
17.
17, got it. Okay, here I go. I have really chopped down this paper to fit within this time, and I hope that I don't go over. So I'll just start, and I'll throw in some remarks as I see fit to keep your attention fixed on me. Okay, so the title of the essay is Avicenna on Transformative Knowledge. So it's a knowledge that transforms the self. Avicenna, in his account of self-knowledge, seeks to avoid what he describes in the Anima of Shafa as the so-called Porphyrian absurdity. The Porphyrian view, labeled elsewhere amongst the commentators as cognitive identification, is an elaboration of Aristotle's famous passage from his De Anima 3.8, where he says, human soul is in a certain sense all entities. Avicenna does not dispute the identity of the intellect and the intelligible, the knower and the known, in this passage, in this Aristotelian passage, as that identity, according to Adamson, is commonplace in Aristotelian philosophy as it comes down to Avicenna. So what is the issue? Avicenna rather disputes the blurring of the distinction between the human soul and the active intellect, or the agent intellect. For the active intellect, knowledge is self-knowledge. So it works, cognitive identification works kind of for active intellect, whereas the human soul requires sense perception to know. I adjudicate the contested Avicennian view of human knowledge and argue that my reading of Avicenna's epistemology accommodates the identity of the knower and the known, in that a potential result of scientific inquiry, that is, the acquisition of knowledge, is the conjunction of the human soul with the active intellect, ittisal. The conjunction provides for an enhancement of the soul by access to a depository of intelligible forms in the active intellect, while preserving the individuality and identity of the soul. So I'm going to skip a number of chapters where I draw on Aristotle's De Anima to lay out what active intellect is and the various layers of human soul. I'll go straight to the epistemology section of the paper. This is section 4, Avicenna on self-knowledge. In his account of the flying man, the famous flying man argument, Avicenna maintains that the existence of the soul can be indicated to, quote, someone who has the power of noticing the truth himself without the need of having to educate him, constantly prod him, and divert him from what causes sophistical errors. In Avicenna's Flying Man in Context, Michael Marmora suggests that the flying man thought experiment involves a process of alerting, tanbih, so that the experimenter is made aware of the awareness of her own existence. But as the flying man argument brackets all bodily faculties contributing to human cognition, the alerting does not presuppose any knowledge of the external world. Now, moving back to Aristotle, for Aristotle, intellecting, noesis, is an action in which the knower, the self-aware subject, and the known, the informed subject, are the same. To be more precise, Aristotle characterizes intellecting as an actuality, energeia, that is, an act that has its end in itself. This intellecting, insofar as human beings are concerned, characterizes, now for Avicenna, the state of the acquired intellect, the aql mustafad, the intellect that is conjoined with the active intellect. The unconjoined, self-aware, rational soul of the flying man is noetic and is an actuality only as an awareness of the existence of its intrinsic essence, wujuda zatihi. As self-knowing, the human intellect only resembles the active intellect because its object of knowledge is identical to the subject of awareness. Therefore, human intellect is like a flicker of celestial intelligence in human beings, but it is as yet uninformed. As the human knower starts thinking through the deliverances of senses, she is involved in a mere movement and has her end outside of herself and is motivated at first by the need to control and manipulate the things around her. Her epistemic action is pragmatic and absorbed in the utility of the intelligible form. The acquisition of knowledge requires that one convert the soul's movement, kinesis, to actualities, energeia. The actual knowledge resulting from such conversion differs from kinetic knowing that takes place, for example, in the technological sciences, where theory is constructed to control, predict, and manipulate the world around us. The Avicennian theory, however, lets the experience in which things show themselves guide our knowing. Elsewhere, Avicenna elaborates on the ethical implications of this view. He claims that the acquisition of justice, adala, the excellence and balance of the soul, paves the way for intellectual labors of inquiry. Justice comes about through self-control and moderation. These qualities help prevent the person from manipulating and appropriating, that is, from moving for the sake of purposes that lie outside the situation of action. Then justice-based semantic ascent from enmattered form in the experience world situates those forms in the theoretical intellect as the contents of knowledge. In the self-knowing that ensues, the knower and the limited known object are unified. In proceeding thus, one begins the cultivation of the acquired intellect, which occurs when repeated acts of actual knowing have brought the knower to the vicinity of the active intellect, where conjunction and the complete identity of the knower and the known is possible. Avicenna proposes that the human mind does not have intellectual memory, so the access to intellectual forms is only through conjunction with the aforementioned active intellect, the depository of intelligible form. He defends that thesis by arguing that if intellectual forms were stored in human intellect, then the intellect would be constantly thinking them, which is impossible. But we do retain knowledge, so Avicenna opts for the active intellect as such a storehouse. Conjunction with the active intellect allows for access to the storehouse, and the perfection of such access, such access would imply. So as I have argued, knowing the world is an essential condition of attaining full self-knowledge. Let's briefly examine Avicenna's complex account of empirical knowledge, knowing the world. Avicenna agrees with the Aristotelian view that sense perception involves the illumination of the active intellect and provides the impetus that moves the human rational soul towards knowledge as self-knowledge. The proponents of Avicenna as an emanatist interpret Avicenna's account of abstraction and cogitation of the sensory forms as only a facon de parleur for emanation of intelligibles from the active intellect. Human sensory experience, on the emanatist view, is only a preparation for the mind's reception of the intelligible forms, and knowledge is only a dispensation, of the active intellect. Those scholars who interpret Avicenna's epistemology, on the other hand, with the Lockean empiricism, so there's emanatists and then the ones who are interpreting Avicenna's epistemology as a form of empiricism or a proto-Lockean empiricism. The empiricist ones pay close attention to the isomorphism between thought and reality that Avicenna posited, and argue that meanings are abstracted from a non-mental, non-conceptual transaction between our senses and the world. In this view, the self-authenticating data given to the mind from outside it ground the claims to knowledge launched in the mind. The emanatists, on the other hand, do not subscribe to these self-authenticating data, but still endorse non-conceptualism about sensory content. For the emanatists, the alleged isomorphism in sensory perception is not cognitively significant. It is at best preparatory for genuine cognition. Deborah Black, for instance, is an emanatist, and she insists that, quote, Avicenna's account of sense perception is thoroughly materialist, and he offers an elaborate set of arguments to prove that representation of material accidents requires the use of a physical organ that is in some way able to convey the spatial relations amongst the parts and properties of the perceived bodies. So I agree with Black's second conjunct, that material accidents are conveyed by a physical organ, but not with the first. Claiming that sense perception is thoroughly materialist, that's the first part, and therefore lacks the involvement of the intellect, further implies that those accidents have no cognitive significance other than a preparatory function. I read Avicenna as advocating a combination of insights from emanatism and empiricism. To put it more precisely, emanation is already involved in sensory experience vis-à-vis the illuminations of the external active intellect, which informs our sensory experience and provides a depository for acquired intellectual forms. For Avicenna, the conceptualization, tasavvur, in sensory experience occurs through the mediation of the active intellect, and the semantic assent featuring the analysis and synthesis of the abstracted features leading to assent, now this time with tasdiq, are also illuminated by the active intellect. Abstraction carves out the conceptualized sensory input in the active intellect's illumination of the occurrence of forms in the imagination, separates out the accidental from the essential, and makes the concepts available for judgment and knowledge through induction, experience, and demonstration. As I suggested earlier, the human knowers must emancipate themselves from the errors and excesses of judgment, so they can align themselves with the conceptualization at work in sensory experience. In this, the cognitive activity contains the form itself in the act and benefits from the storehouse of forms in active intellect. It may ultimately culminate in conjunction with the active intellect, and an important aspect of this conjunction is the identity of knowing and self-knowing, when self-knowing now contains the knowledge of the world, as the latter is in the knowing act now. So, in conclusion, my interpretation of Avicenna as embracing an intermediate position between emanatism and proto-Lockean empiricism accommodates the Avicennian insight that through scientific practice, that is, the acquisition of knowledge, the rational soul cultivates the self and can achieve perfection by conjoining with the active intellect, in which there is an already an identity relation between the intellect and the intellectual form. In conjunction, the intellect has immediate access to the intelligible forms and therefore knows itself and its objects immediately. On this view, the common sense conceptual framework is not replaced by a different framework which is in better keeping with scientific progress. Rather, science brings to view the richness of detail implicitly available in sense experience, and furthermore, through proper philosophical framing, this scientific activity elevates the empirical self to the level of a celestial intellect. Now, the importance of Avicenna for the Nizamiye tradition is undeniable. However, much work needs to be done to see the extent of this influence in the light of our current struggles within epistemology and our efforts to read Avicenna in their light. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for questions. So if you'd raise your hand and someone will bring you a mic.
Yeah, thank you for these insightful lectures. Just some questions about Ibn Khaldun. I totally agree with you, Mr. Rayes, about the necessity of decolonizing the readings of Ibn Khaldun, and I read also just recently the book of Irving, and I found it completely in the same line of all what had been done in the 19th centuries. Unfortunately, it's still very urgent, an emergency as a problem to deal with. And Mr. Mokdad as well has shaped things about Ibn Khaldun. I will be speaking tomorrow also on Ibn Khaldun, but you left the logical side, so that I'm fortunate that, yes, you mentioned a little, but I will be speaking about the logical side. My question for Mr. Waseem Rayes, don't you think that Al-Afghani, we have to go further than what he did, because he's still with all this movement of Nahda, be completely referring to the Western side as the paradigm, because Egypt was translating many books of the Enlightenment, and he still said, we are late, but you know we will be reaching you. And I think Al-Farani, and the most important features of and characters, I might say, of the Nahda are still to be decolonizing also. Don't you agree? I don't know. Yeah. Yes, we have to go further than Al-Farani, not just to respond to Renan and say, okay, we have also a big tradition. No, we have also to say that the Nahda participated to a certain extent to colonizing the mind. I think, and sorry for this long question.
No, thank you very much for this question. And just please pardon me, because jet lagged from a very little sleep, but I agree completely with you. I think that I try to limit myself to Ibn Khaldun and the effect of that kind of mentality on the analysis of Ibn Khaldun. I found Robert Orwell's Ibn Khaldun published by Oxford in 2018, where he, in the beginning, he wants to argue that Ibn Khaldun is irrelevant. He says Ibn Khaldun is irrelevant, and from on high, he wants to teach us, this guy, misguided people, that Ibn Khaldun is irrelevant. He's not a philosopher. So the fact that Orwell can write this book and not get any kind of pushback and be accepted by one of the most prestigious public, I think it's Princeton, if I'm not mistaken.
Princeton, yes, it's Princeton.
Publication to me is shocking, and I actually, the more to go into the details of the book, it's shocking how this this book was approved. But it was approved because it's the same kind of mentality that is also in Gibb, that it is also, like you see, it's the rawness of Renan for me is how is reflected in the more polite form in others. I don't want to monopolize the discussion here, but that's, I think, as a short answer, I agree with you. There's more to it, but I agree.
Down here.
Assalamu alaikum. I just want to thank all the speakers. I had a question for Mohammad Faruque. I just want to thank you for your presentation. It was mesmerizing, mashallah. What did you meant by we cannot discover ourselves through ourselves? And you said that it's an a priori type of knowledge to know ourselves. And how is this journey of self-knowledge, how should it affect us spiritually speaking, in terms of kashf, and in terms of trying to unravel all the obstacles, as you said, the ego, and to be able to reach a better society? Thanks.
Thank you. I think there are two parts to this question. So when I'm talking about the very basic, most foundational self-knowledge, going beyond the subject-object dichotomy. So in everyday knowledge, everyday sense, if you are to kind of thinking about yourself, having a kind of knowledge of yourself in your mind, it involves a kind of duality. So there are kind of detailed arguments, but basically you're not able to establish self-knowledge at the most basic level through simply thinking, because thinking automatically implies a duality, a projection of yourself into the mind. It's like seeing yourself in the mirror. Yeah, from one perspective it's me, but from another it's not me. The same is happening in the mind. So then how do we know that we are not, there is a level that kind of transcends that? Well, you can think about many different examples. It's also something that you find in some modern Western philosophers too. So think aware that you are watching something. But then, there is a background consciousness, because when that attention is broken, you come back to yourself, oh, I was so absorbed that I even didn't notice that I was watching. But you clearly remember those moments even more perfectly. So there is that very good example, but there are many other examples to kind of prove that at the most basic level, self-knowledge, self-consciousness kind of transcends subject-object duality. But then it is also at a higher level, I think, connected to what I call non-reflective consciousness, and its higher mode. So spiritual exercises and meditative experiences, you definitely can come to a greater awareness of yourself, and ultimately you should be able to sort of dissolve your ego, the I, me, mind complex, or the thinking mind. In Buddhist philosophy, sometimes there's a term, monkey mind, jumping around, thinking. So, I mean, there's a very shortcut way to explain this. So Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. Like thinking defines, his essence of the self. There was a yogi, who recently gave a speech, and he said, in order to have self-knowledge, you have to say this: when I no longer think, I am everybody. Because then there is no me as a subject that is trying to kind of point a finger at itself. But that takes a lot of kind of rigorous process, I guess, spiritual exercises, but ultimately it is possible, at least on some level. Yeah, like think about deep meditative states where your sense of the self is definitely not the everyday self. Yeah. So ultimately you reach something called pure consciousness at the highest level. That's the kind of self without any thought, imagination, or duality. Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Are there other questions over here? Dr. Johnson?
Just thank you for all presentations. I want to continue on this issue of self-knowledge because I just wonder, I want your advice on that. Couldn't it be that Mullah Sadr was influenced by this famous hadith, who knows himself, knows his Lord, which was very influential in the mystic tradition very early, and who was omnipresent in Ghazali and other thinkers. And so I see Mullah Sadr a kind of combination of this mystical influence and maybe something of Ibn Sina, but then more than in the Shifa, in the notes in Tariqat, the way he articulates self-knowledge there is a little bit different from Shifa. And Gary Kakwa has written a quite interesting book on that, so I think we have to consider this, as a subject, if you know yourself as an object as well, so there is an identification on that level. Only in God, of course, there is an identification between subject of knowledge, object of knowledge, and the act of knowledge. That is the divine. That's the difference. But so, is it possible that in the background, I said not, of course, I think Mullah Sadr offers something new, the final analysis, but that in the background you have this kind of influence.
Sure. So this is the hadith attributed to the Prophet, Man arafa nafsahu faqad arafa rabbahu, that you're referring to. It's very common in Sufism to talk about it. But I'm personally interested in arguments. So Sufis don't normally provide kind of arguments. But in Mullah Sadr, there are all of these arguments. And as Dr. Azadpur was explaining, and if you are familiar with Ibn Sina and also after Ibn Sina, Sohrawardi and many, many others, then we can see Mullah Sadr is not, some of these arguments are not arising like out of the blue. There is a kind of long continuity. But I think in Mullah Sadr's case, that statement needs to be qualified, or also similar philosophers. So it should not be simply man arafa nafsahu faqad arafa rabbahu. It should be something like man arafa nafsahu bi'ilmi al-huduri faqad arafa rabbahu bidhalika al-ilm. Actually, this is something, because the concept of hudur, starting with Sohrawardi, plays such a notable role. At a most basic level, it's not thinking. The self is present to itself. So presence, hudur, plays a very important role. Ultimately, what you're saying would make sense, but then there are all of these arguments, steps, etc.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. لي ملاحظتين ليست أسئلة بالخصوص للأستاذ واسم وللأستاذ عرفة. نص l'attitude de Renan sur l'islam et la science, évidemment, c'est une coupure fondamentale entre le sémitisme et l'hellénisme qui est antérieur. Et est-ce qu'il ne faudrait pas placer ces discours de Renan dans un contexte beaucoup plus général qui va de la philologie allemande qui a produit la différenciation entre l'arianisme et le sémitisme jusqu'à ce que va devenir dans les années 80, en passant par Auguste Comte, l'attitude de Jules Ferry pour carrément parler de races inférieures et de races supérieures qui doivent les civiliser. Dans ce sens, il me semble que quand on cite ce texte de Renan, on le prend pour un texte sui generis de Renan, mais Renan est solidaire d'un mouvement philosophique qui est le positivisme, et le rapport avec Kant est bien établi. Et c'est une évolution qui va jusqu'à ce que j'ai appelé cette attitude comme celle de Jules Ferry qui parle carrément de race supérieure et de race inférieure. Ce n'est pas une question, mais c'est pour circonscrire la citation de ce texte de l'islam et la science. Voilà. Pour Ami Arfa, est-ce que on peut vraiment faire une histoire judicieuse du Kelam?
Here, you don't need any translation? Speak French. Okay. But the terminology is almost the same. Is in fact regretting that it was about your intervention, Dr. Rayes. He thinks that we don't have to refer to the famous text of Ernest Renan, Islam and Science, as a kind of sui generis text because it has to be, according to him, to Dr. Jamal, situated in a global movement in link with the Germanic or German distinction between Arianism and Semitism, and more generally about the colonial movement which in France distinguished between inferior race and superior race with a French famous politician called Jules Ferry, and more generally about the question of racialist movement in Europe, which has its background or its intellectual background in the positivism of Auguste Comte.
Can I comment on this briefly?
Yes, go ahead and reply.
Yeah, okay.
Then we'll get another one.
Yeah, I totally agree. I simply looked at Renan as, like not as a foundational text, but it's the inner logic of that text. And what I found also interesting is Afghani's response to that text. What I equally found interesting is that both texts were never translated into Arabic until fairly recently. At least there is one, in Afghani's response was first published in Egypt along with all collections in 2005. And it all, putting all those pieces together, it tells you a story about the intellectual, part of it is about our own intellectuals engaging at that time, engaging with Western intellectuals. And Afghani and Abdo, I believe that people could easily see the racism of Renan and others, but they must have dismissed it as a personal prejudice, and that you can separate the discourse from the prejudice and see it even as a form of maybe some kind of radical critique. But fundamentally, I believe they reproduce, as the professor who was asking the question, the same Orientalist discourse where it accepts there is a fundamental division between the West and the rest. That's my, I could totally agree with you. I don't think that there is any disagreement. If I hope I didn't misunderstand you. I agree with you. But the history of that text is very interesting. And then see the same kind of patterns that exist in Renan's thinking reproduced in Gibb. So you say Renan was clearly anti-Semitic. And it's anti-Semitic not only against Jews, but against Arabs as being Semite. Gibb, in a certain way, could be the opposite in a sense of a fellow Semite. Like he was very sympathetic, but he reproduced the same kind of othering toward Islam and Muslims. And so when he writes Ibn Khaldun cannot be a man of faith. Whether this is apparent or real, we can put it on the side, and I believe that there's reality in it. But he cannot see any kind of you can be a man of faith and a philosopher. These two are absolutely separate. And then we have Orwin comes in and reproduces the same kind of thinking. But I know, maybe, again, I didn't want to...
Professor Al-Amrani Jamal, will you ask your second question?
La deuxième question, c'est pour Mme Arfa. Oui. recourir à la à l'histoire du Kelam, à Ibn Khaldun, comme pour d'ailleurs toutes les sciences, tout ce chapitre 6 concernant l'histoire des sciences, dont le Kelam, l'impression que Ibn Khaldun fait un peu l'œuvre d'un notaire. Il marque les grandes œuvres qui ont marqué chaque discipline. Et est-ce qu'on peut réellement établir une histoire du Kelam à travers cette perspective plutôt de résumé ou d'attitude notariale plutôt que de rigueur sur la genèse des problèmes, la genèse des origines, des références, etc. Et cela m'amène à une remarque, si vous permettez. La fortune qu'a eu Ibn Khaldun dans l'orientalisme, elle n'est pas gratuite, à mon avis, parce que Ibn Khaldun est un homme de la fermeture. Il est en train de clore tout. C'est fini. On a passé, on a fait les sciences, on n'est plus dans la chose. Et c'est exactement ce que l'orientalisme voulait. Il fallait arrêter et finir avec la culture arabe et islamique pour adopter et chercher à s'acculturer dans l'Occident du 19e siècle et du 20e siècle. Voilà.
Translation, I think, Dr. Arfa. You don't need translation.
Je vais essayer. Tu te rappelles l'heureuse idée que tu as lancée il y a plusieurs années, Ibn Khaldun et la philosophie. Et c'était très prometteur dans le temps. Parce qu'on voit là, comment il travaille en tant que philosophe aussi. On voit la formation philosophique, sa vision philosophique qui conditionne sa vision des choses. Maintenant, les présentations qu'il fait, c'est un peu comme Farabi, comme les sciences sapscientielles sont parachevées depuis longtemps. Avec les musulmans, il n'y a plus rien à ajouter. Les sciences religieuses, le Kelam et tout ça, c'est parachevé, il n'y a plus rien à faire. Il y a l'hostilité qui risque de changer, c'est la manière du maître, comment il va enseigner cela. Mais bien sûr, c'est parachevé, il n'y a plus rien, presque plus rien de jeu. Mais quand même, il parle un peu de ce qu'il entendait de l'autre côté de la Méditerranée, ce qu'il entendait, qu'il y avait encore de la science vers l'Orient et tout ça. Il se présente comme ça. Maintenant, sa présentation du Kelam, qu'est-ce qu'il fait en fin de compte? Même pour la mystique, comment parler d'une manière sensée, raisonnée, compréhensible pour les nodars? Comment parler même de la mystique? C'est-à-dire, il prend le moule philosophique, en fin de compte, de la science pour traiter de mystique. Sa présentation du Kelam est très discutable. Par exemple, le rôle de Jouaini, on ne peut pas mettre Jouaini comme... C'est peut-être un pré-moderne Jouaini. Mais l'avantage de Brouch, c'est de montrer que le Jouaini, quand même, il a préparé sur la voie des modernes. Ibn Khaldun, non, il n'en dit rien. Il est resté avec. Il n'a pas eu je pense qu'il n'a pas dû lire tout Jouaini. Non, c'est très... Et puis, le fait d'achever de dire que maintenant le Kelam est terminé, parce que c'est une version mystique du Kelam, que tu connais bien. On atteint un maqam al-tawhid ou al-arfan. C'est le même maqam, en fin de compte. Il y a un raccourci dans sa présentation du Kelam. Il y a un parti pris contre le mu'tazilisme, ça on ne peut pas le nier. Non, Ibn Khaldun. On peut discuter longtemps, les partis pris, les présentations, tout ça. Mais par contre, ce que j'essaie de vous faire, il y a une science, il y a une essence de la science achevée, stable et tout. Maintenant, on mesure, on prend comme un critère de cette essence et pour voir le déroulement de l'histoire. C'est ce que fait Ibn Khaldun. Les aléas de l'histoire, le développement par rapport à la conformité de cette essence de la science. Ce que je voulais faire tout simplement, c'est au moins, j'ai vu quelqu'un de Mutakalimoun, Joudoud. Est-ce qu'on s'est intéressé à se demander, il a dit que le Kelam est bel et bien achevé. On continue, Hamel Sunnah, mais il est bel et bien achevé. Est-ce qu'on s'est demandé sur l'essence même du Kelam? On peut discuter sa présentation du Kelam dans une... Est-ce qu'on s'est demandé, c'est-à-dire l'arsenal scientifique et logique du Kelam? Est-ce que le rapport du dogme et de l'argumentation? Au moins il l'a fait, mais on peut le dépasser. Ça, c'est ce qui manque un peu à nos théologiens modernes. Ça manque terriblement. Au moins reprendre ces interrogations. On ne peut pas reprendre Ibn Khaldun, au moins le travail qu'il fait, mais avec le recul, avec la distance, avec le truc de la modernité. C'est ce que j'ai proposé, tout simplement. Mais, tu vois, c'était un peu ça. Mais bon, on peut en discuter après.
Maybe they asked me to summarize.
Okay.
Could you summarize it because I know that you understand the French.
Snel, go ahead.
No.
Oh, go ahead.
I think the question is, it was about your choice of Ibn Khaldun and specifically about the chapter 6 and more specifically about the way he is examining the Kelam and according to Dr. Amrani, Ibn Khaldun is not a good doer to explore the question of the history of Kelam because of his observation is more, according to him, a documentalist or a library observation, more than a real history of ideas for different reasons. And he was asking you, instead of to look to somebody who is more not, whose perspective is more notarial, he said, than, how do you call it, an history of idea. Why you didn't really examine the question of the evolution of Kalam through other authors who are more involved in the question of the genus and development and extension of Kalam. And your answer, it was about that your choice, but you mostly, if I understood, agrees with Dr. Amrani, that you think the way Ibn Khaldun even with different lack, and you give the example of Al-Juwayni, if I understand, and you think that he is not really aware about the extension of the idea of Al-Juwayni, but the way, there is an idea I think very important from, and you were answering that he think why the Orientalists in the 19th century were very interested on Ibn Khaldun. He thinks that because he was the thinker of the decline or the thinker of the closing, and it is in accordance with what the Orientalists were thinking in the 19th century, and he thinks that when we choose this perspective, it is in itself a declinist or a declining perspective, and you think it is more in accordance with the way we can maybe rethink the history of Al-Kalam from more modern perspective. I understood what you said.
We have two more questions here, then we need
ونادى لسان الكون بالخمول. La fameuse parole de Bruce. C'est comme l'univers a parlé, a appelé les gens à la léthargie. فاستجاب. C'est la fameuse. Pour dire
the museum of the world is asking for decline.
And استجاب.
Professor Butterworth? He needs the mic.
Just very quickly, 2 points. We seem to be forgetting that Renan is the disciple of Kant. And we need to remember, I think, in trying to account for the history of philosophy, the role that Kantian positivism plays. Yeah. And maybe ask ourselves whether it doesn't continue to this day. I don't know the answer to the question, which is why I'm going to put it out. Is Gibb a Kantian? or is he some other kind of historicist? Is that what's going on? Must we always be enthralled to a historicist reading of philosophy? I would put that, especially to Waseem, in trying to think these things through. And I'm sorry, okay. And this business of
Really
Robert
close.
Irwin. Robert Irwin is at least equally insulting to all things Arab. He has found that there is nothing good about Alf Layla wa Layla. Nothing good about Ibn Khaldun. One wonders then why we read him. What does he have to teach us? I don't know the answer to that question, but clearly he sells books, which is why the publishers are willing to publish it. We scholars can't do anything about that except to write books that are equally good sellers. This second thought that I have on this vein, no, let me just stop there.
Shukran. Are there any replies? Otherwise, we're going over here.
Okay, just two comments and one question to Dr. Muhammad regarding the presentation on selfhood at Mullah Sadra. Number one is that I'm glad that we are not falling into the trap of comparing for the sake of comparing. That you point out Mullah Sadra's selfhood and also Descartes' selfhood, because these two scholars have different methodologies. Mullah Sadra is not opposing to dualism. He's about unity. He's opposed to dualism and multiplicity. And Descartes is about dualism. So, and I'm not sure whether you stated in your paper or not regarding the 4 journeys Asfar al-Arba'ah in Mullah Sadra, which I think if you haven't, then that might be the crux of Mullah Sadra's idea about achieving this unity and fana fi nafs. That's the comment. And number one. Number two is whenever we touch upon a concept or we introduce a concept, it is best for us to explain it. And for the lack of better word, it would be insufficient for us to simply, dismiss it and, it is probably difficult for you to understand, that kind of line. It's best once you touch upon it, and it's best for you to explain, because as quote alluded to, Einstein said, if we can't explain something succinctly, it means we don't really understand it. Now the question is about fitrah. This is a huge concept. What is fitrah? You also point out to Hobbesian fitrah. What is your understanding about fitrah is? If not from the understanding of Islam, then what is your ijtihad on that? Thank you.
Just very briefly, because we have to go to coffee and get back to the next session.
So first of all, my talk was not about Mullah Sadra's philosophy per se. As I said, I'm doing what is called cross-cultural philosophy, and the methodology is clearly laid out. So I have done historical work. I have solid training, philological and those training, and lots of publication about that. But in this context, I was saying that when I'm talking about anthropocosmic self, the term itself is not in Mullah Sadra. And those arguments, the details, if you have given me, you can find in my book or in other articles. So I think, it's there, the arguments for self-knowledge through what I call non-reflective consciousness. So that's my first point. Secondly, to talk about what is fitrah itself would take few hours, because Avicenna has one, interpretation, Ghazali another, Ibn Taymiyyah another. Again, I'm not interested as a historian, what is the meaning of this? I was also not doing comparative philosophy. So I was doing philosophy with historical material. It's probably difficult for us to understand because we kind of tend to it's perfectly fine to be a historian. We need historians. But I'm simply at this point in my career, or naturally, I'm not inclined in a historical direction. So I was doing philosophy with Mullah Sadra and all of these people, putting them in conversation with another and making a final claim. And so I'm refuting some arguments like individualism, whether it's Hobbesian or Nietzschean or Kantian. But I'm making use of Mullah Sadra's arguments. But the question that I asked at the beginning, what does it mean to be human in the wake of the Enlightenment? That question Mullah Sadr never asked. So it's the question that you're asking that determines your methodology and a lot of those things.
Okay, thank you very much. And we have about 12 minutes for coffee or tea, and then we have another session, so we have to yalla yamshi to the coffee. And let's give our panelists another applause. We had a very interesting discussion here this afternoon.
Değerli hocalarımıza bizler de çok teşekkür ediyoruz ve programa bir 15 dakika ara